Hello. So today we begin a week of feminist theory. Feminist theory seeks to describe, analyze, explain and transform the social world, particularly the gendered social world, questioning gendered asymmetries and hierarchies, and it offers us tools to look at power hierarchies in other categories of asymmetrical difference such as class, caste, race, regional or national origin and so on. So with that, let's begin today's class. Now many of you might wonder, taking many of our freedoms and privileges for granted, as to why the need for looking at feminist theory and why now. In terms of laws, women are mostly equal. In terms of the workforce, now you see women entering several different disciplines and professions that earlier were not as much women's domains. So in this particular context, why do we still need feminist theory? So in order to make the case for that, I've put up a little bit of data for us to see. On the left, the green picture that we have up here shows paid labor force participation rate for women in India and elsewhere. And as you can see, it is basically one of the lowest in terms of the countries shown over here. So India has 23%, this is 2019 data, of paid labor force participation. This is not to say that women are not working, but a large part of what they do constitutes unpaid care work or unpaid familial factory work, or in industries which don't necessarily pay the woman, but then they pay the family for particular work, and the control of that money may or may not lie with the woman. The other data that I have up here is land ownership, and this shows the disproportionate land ownership that women own in India. Globally also, it is said that women own less than 10% of the world's land. So, considering this, it is an important sociological question that what is it that is keeping women from the workforce despite so many laws now prohibiting discrimination in that domain, and law allowing women to own land, and yet a very small percentage of women actually end up owning property. What does it mean to see like a feminist? And here I am drawing from the work of scholar Nivedita Menon, feminist scholar Nivedita Menon, where in her book she talks about seeing like a feminist as being able to uncover what she calls as nude makeup. Nude makeup basically refers to spending hours painting your face, putting lipstick, blushes, eye makeup and all of that in order to appear naturally beautiful. So the focus is on makeup that makes one look natural. She argues that the social order is kind of like that. The underlying institutions, the normative expectations, the standards that are set in society, all of this are putting in the work to make gendered hierarchies and gendered division of labors and gendered social relations appear normal. So she says, as a feminist scholar, as a feminist theorist, the work is to do what in Microsoft Word is often called reveal formatting, to show the hierarchical ordering of the world and how this is around gender, and that such a hierarchical ordering of the world, the gendered social world, is a key to maintaining the current social order. Then she also alerts us to looking at how different categories enable us to lead very different lives. So she writes, to live lives marked male and female is to live very different realities, and feminist theory tries to uncover some of that. The other thing that feminist theory has done is to offer tools to understand how power and hierarchy works. So this now happens across categories, not just the category of gender, and feminist theory offers tools to look at how the social order works to hierarchically arrange other categories such as caste, class, regional identity, able-bodiedness, neurodivergence, and so on. So what I want to do today is look at the movement of feminist thinking from its early days and how ideas have changed and the kind of debates that inform the development of feminist theory itself. So this is an early work from the 18th century by Mary Wollstonecraft, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And considering the context in this, she is arguing for the right of women to education, to learning, and to own property also is something that she argues. And here, although when she looks at women, she is not so much looking at women as an independent subject who has the inalienable right to education per se, but she is arguing for education for women so that they can become better mothers, better patriots, better companions to man. So still as an adjunct to man, but considering her times, it is an argument for women's advancement that then becomes a precursor to stronger movements and stronger ideas about women's right to political participation. Women's right to political participation, one of the key moments in that is the 1848 Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls. And there is a caricature that I have put up here from that time, where when this was held for 2 days, women in the United States gathered together to deliberate upon, to speak about, to do consciousness raising, to talk to each other about their experiences, and to kind of come to a understanding of women's position and role in society and the possibilities forward, primarily also to argue for the women's right to vote. In this caricature, you see women gathered giving speeches and talking to each other, but on the balcony, you see men kind of heckling and making fun of the women gathered here. In this cartoon, it says, "Ye May's session of Ye Women's Rights Convention, Ye orator of Ye day denouncing Ye lords of creation." So in some ways, making fun of women gathering. On the right, I have what is called our roll of honor. It contains all the signatures to the declaration of sentiments that comes out from this convention. I want to read out a little bit of the declaration of sentiments. It says, "When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man," they're referring to women, "to assume among the people of the earth a position different from that which they have hitherto occupied, but one to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them." So they are coming here to the idea of inalienable rights, the Enlightenment thought. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." And it goes on. I will not read the whole thing. It's available freely online, and I encourage you to go back and read it. But this was one of the early statements asking for a women's right to vote. Well, the feminist movement, we are talking about the United States here right now, has always been fraught with exclusions, but then also incorporations and becoming richer and more nuanced, self-reflexive, and while from the outside it might appear as embodying contradictions, but I would argue that it is these contradictions that in fact enrich feminist theory. And hopefully that would become clear as we move on with today's lecture and with the lectures that will follow in feminist theory this week. So, Sojourner Truth, a freed black slave woman, gave this speech at the Women's Rights Convention in Ohio, where she questioned some of the ideas of the feminist movement of the time, which was mainly led by white feminists, as to if you're talking for a gender unity or a gender solidarity, for women to come together towards the fight for women's liberation, have you forgotten race? So have you forgotten that white women have a very different set of concerns, and that white women are also the oppressors when we bring race as a category of analysis? The speech is slightly longer than what I have up here, but there are 2 paragraphs that I want to read out to give you a sense of what she is arguing for. She says, that man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. An entire woman? Look at me, look at my arm. I have ploughed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. An entire woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it. And I bear the lash as well. I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. An entire woman. I have borne 13 children and seen most of them sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? There is another bit between this, which I am not reading out, but this next one I am. Then that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as man, cause Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. So she very powerfully asserts, that was also conveyed in the Seneca Falls, of women's rights, but in that she also asserts that she is oppressed not just because of her gender, but also because of her race. So bringing in more questions and reflexivity into feminist thinking. So women in the United States won the right to vote in 1929, and I've put up a map up here for us to see of when in the world did different countries women win the right to vote. In the United States it was 1929. In India, women win the right to vote along with men when India becomes independent in 1947. Although it's also important to mention that in 1935, in voting, women above 30 were allowed to vote, and only those that were married. So oftentimes, this we've seen in many countries, women have been restricted based on ownership of property or marital status, or as we see in Canada, indigenous women won the right to vote much later than white women. Switzerland wins the right to vote, women win the right to vote only in the 1970s. So this right to vote, simple right to political participation, is also a very, very recent right, a very, very recent understanding that we take for granted, that it's voting day, we all will go to vote. And why is voting even important, right? Voting is our political participation. It's our say in making the world in the way that we want to make it. Now, feminist movement has usually been classified into 3, sometimes 4 waves. The waves here is an analogy. It doesn't necessarily mean that there is one that ebbs and then subsides and the other one then kind of takes over. It mainly refers to moments where feminist movement peaked over particular causes and a particular issue that became very, very strong. Largely in the Western world. In India, it's progressed slightly differently, and I will briefly touch upon that also in today's lecture. So the first wave of feminism that I also gave some insights into in the previous slides was largely to do with women's political participation and women's right to vote. Some of the early works in that, I spoke about Mary Wollstonecraft, but Olympe de Gouges, the Declaration of Rights of Women and of the Female Citizen, comes from France. Olympe de Gouges was eventually sent to the Guillotine in 1793 and was classified as an unnatural woman because she was asking for rights for women and also for being a revolutionary. In 1851, I read out the speech, Entire Woman. 1848, the Declaration of Sentiments at the Seneca Falls Convention. 1884, Frederick Engels, although we wouldn't classify him strictly as a feminist theories, writes about the origin of the family, private property and the state, and links women's oppression to the notion of private property and private property ownership. We've already had a lecture on Charlotte Perkins Gilman and two other representative works that I've put up here. One is Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own, where Virginia Woolf asks the simple question, if Shakespeare was a genius and could produce such creative works, and around that time there were several writers, beautiful literature was coming out, but where was women's literature? Why were they not writing? And so she has this fictional character, Judith, who she writes off as Shakespeare's sister, who was also as smart and as precocious and willful, and yet both of them received a very different training. While Shakespeare was sent to elite schools, his sister was asked to be more docile, do embroidery, be at home, and therefore never really got the opportunity to, let's say, go to London and explore the theatre world like Shakespeare did. And in asking these questions, she's also alerting us to the notion of where does genius come from? Like, quite obviously, it's not emerging from working class populations because they're barely making ends meet, and that you need a certain kind of environment, a certain amount of leisure, and a whole lot of prerequisite in order to even explore one's creative genius. Now, I've also mentioned here 1916, Margaret Sanger opens the first birth control clinic in New York. Now, this was a very, very strong aspect of the feminist movement, but also something that was politically quite divisive in terms of women's control over their own bodies. Now, once women in the United States get the right to vote in 1929, many of them are told that, fine, now you've got the right to vote, you've got what you were asking for, now go back home from the protest marches that you were in and let things come back to normal. And so several years between, let's say, 1929 and early 1950s or late 1940s don't see as much of feminist activism as the earlier phase. And then again it erupts in the 1950s. So questions about what makes it erupt in the 1950s and then what was going on in the interim period is something that I'm going to try and answer. So if you recall, this is 1940s is also the time of the Second World War, and most able-bodied men in Western Europe and the United States are sent off to the war. But factories still need to work and products still need to be produced, including things needed for military operations. And so women are urged to join the factory workforce and the whole lot of other workforce that is needed. In this image, you see a very iconic image of Rosie the Riveter, and notice the determined look, the muscled arms, and the working class gear that she is wearing, right? So women came out of their homes, they joined the workforce. Through the war, they enabled the country to continue working because of their labor force participation. Well, as soon as the war was over, government policies and the general discourse asked the women to go back home. The men came back from the war and needed to be given jobs, and so factory work again became a male domain. But that brief period where women came out, met each other, did the work, they realized that they are also equally capable of doing the work and that they also do want to explore aspects of their life that are beyond just the home. So the second wave feminism is largely to do with the struggle for being able to work outside the home and questions of equal pay for equal work, right? Because they saw their capability and they saw the potential of doing one's creative, paid economic work. Well, so Betty Friedan, The Feminine Mystique. Betty Friedan talks about how the suburban woman, despite the prosperity, the appliances, the birth control, all things that were meant to free her from drudgery, and yet she lacks the kind of satisfaction or happiness that one would assume that she would have. So she questions that. Kate Millett's Sexual Politics is central, as is Bell Hooks' Anti-Woman. But between all of these texts, the term second wave feminist movement, the idea of the wave itself, comes from Martha Lear's New York Times essay 1968, which looks at the current movement of that time in the 1960s and calls it the feminist wave. In the 1960s, the United States government passes legislation enabling the idea of equal pay for equal work. There are several other laws such as Title IX, allowing for women's participation in sports, basically enabling women to come out in the various areas that they were asking for. So then in the 1990s, we come to what is called the third wave feminism. Here the questions are different. Here the questions of intersectionality, of queer theory, of looking at notions of bodily autonomy become central to women's movements and feminist theories. So I've put up here two representative works from the third wave. One is Naomi Wolf's The Beauty Myth, how images of beauty are used against women. In The Beauty Myth, Naomi Wolf argues that even as the presence of women in the public sphere has increased, they are still bound by ideas about what a woman's body should look like and are encouraged to reach unrealistic ideals of beauty, such as the Barbie doll, for example. This leads to unhealthy behaviors by women and unrealistic expectations between the genders. This time is also a time where difference and different ways of inhabiting gendered identities becomes open, and also third world women reach out questioning what is the category that is central to feminism becomes a question. I've put up here again some key texts associated with this time period. We will be going into Patricia Hill Collins' Black Feminist Thought and Judith Butler's Gender Trouble in the subsequent lectures, but Chandra Mohanty's Under Western Feminism, she basically looks at Western feminism as a white woman-led movement which has only particular concerns and essentializes the third world woman as always a victim, as not an independent subject capable of fighting for their own rights. So this came as a solid critique to the feminist movement, and in that vein I want to spend a short amount of time talking about what were the feminist struggles and feminist questions that have inspired the women's movement in India. And for that, for a broader view of that, I highly encourage you to go back and look at The History of Doing by Radha Kumar. It's an illustrated account for the movement for women's rights in India between 1800 and 1900. Beautifully illustrated, but also very detailed, and in terms of bringing to the fore several women's rights struggles in India. One of the key moments in the women's movement in India was the Mathura rape case. Mathura was a young teenage tribal girl who, while going out with her boyfriend, was arrested by the police and raped in police custody. She went to court, and initially in the High Court she wins the case, but when the case is taken to the Supreme Court, Mathura loses the case and the policemen that raped her are acquitted, basically with the argument that Mathura was already out with her boyfriend. She's somebody who may be promiscuous and so did not resist the rape. This led to huge protests by women in India, basically questioning this judgment and arguing for both stricter punishments for custodial rape, for re-looking at rape laws, which by that time were basically working with colonial law, and also questions of bodily autonomy. So I just put that as one very significant case, but yet one case. And then women's movement in India has worked around questions of reform, questions related to dowry, questions related to alcoholism. It has also been very central in relation to environmental movements, more recently with the Nirbhaya rape case and Me Too movement. So a lot of contextual struggles have informed the feminist movement in India. In the rest of the lecture, I want to spend some time reading out what feminist theorists have to write about or say about feminist theory. So we'll start with Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex, and she writes, "Humanity is male and man defines woman not in herself but relative to him." Here she is making the very important point of women as a subject in her own right, and not as an appendage to man. She is not regarded as an autonomous being. She is defined and differentiated with reference to man and not he with reference to her. She is the incidental, the inessential as opposed to the essential. He is the subject, he is the absolute, she is the other. Audre Lorde writes in 1979, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat them at their own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." So she's also calling out for different methods, to use different tools. And feminist theory does come up with a lot of tools that allow us to see how the hierarchical ordering of the social world happens and what goes behind what Nivedita Menon calls the nude makeup. 1989, Catherine McKinnon, in Toward a Feminist Theory of the State, writes, "Feminism, as I understand it, is not a set of values or an ideology, but a method of analysis. It identifies sexuality as a social sphere of power, inequality, and hierarchy. Sexuality is to feminism what work is to Marxism, that which is most one's own, yet most taken away." Then Bell Hooks, in Theory as Liberatory Practice, says, "I came to theory because it was hurting. When our lived experience of theorizing is fundamentally linked to the process of self-recovery, of collective liberation, no gap exists between theory and practice." And this is a very, very important way to understand feminist theory, because this is perhaps one of those theories which very well illustrate the connection between theory and practice. You cannot separate feminist theory from feminist movement, and the progress of feminist movement, of the waves of feminism, would not have been possible had feminist theory not evolved to enable all that thinking. So feminist theory and feminist practice go like this, they are hand in hand, and that's a very important way for the idea of not just explaining or describing the world, but also transforming it, the notion of praxis. Feminist theorists look at the social ordering of the world, and the social ordering of the world is patriarchal. How do we understand patriarchy? Patriarchy is a system of social structures and practices in which men dominate, oppress, and exploit women. Patriarchy's chief institution is the family, and that patriarchy has no gender. It works best when it appears as common sense. So I've put up a poster of the film Lapata Ladies over here, also to show how certain behaviors, certain gendered social relations are taken as the norm, and I think the movie quite nicely depicts that in terms of how are women or men supposed to behave, and how we take much of that for granted, and how both men and women participate in the perpetuation of patriarchy. And patriarchy basically structures the lives of not just women, but also man. The idea of the male breadwinner, for example, as an enforced way of being for men, comes out of a patriarchal structure. Now, to reiterate, there are several strands of feminism. Just to give a few examples, liberal feminism looks at the idea of rights and law and seeks to make women and men equal in the domains of institutions. Radical feminism very squarely takes on the notion of bodily autonomy and patriarchy, whereas cultural feminism strongly asserts difference, like there is a woman's way of being, and that we need to as much bring that into the norm as the man's way of being. It's a man's world, but we now want to also recreate the world in the image of, or in the understanding of, women. So cultural feminism very much privileges difference. Marxist feminism and socialist feminism look at the relationship of materiality, of economic forces, and the relationship between exploitation and oppression. that we studied when we were studying social reproduction theory. Third world feminism and black feminism and Dalit feminism and actually queer feminism question the white woman-centric feminism and also question what is understood as the category of woman. I'll leave you with this question: what if woman is not a fixed category? And through the course of the next week's lectures, we'll come to reflect more on this question and what this even means through queer theory, let's say, or even speeches like "Ain't I a Woman," really unsettling that category of woman. Then what or who is the subject of feminism itself? So I'll leave you with that. I know there's lots more questions that I've left unanswered, but I'm hoping that the lectures in the next few days would open up some of these ideas. Thank you so much.